In May 2016, I met up with Peter Thoday, presenter and narrator of the 1980s television series The Victorian Kitchen Garden. Now 82, I met Peter at his home in southwest England.
So then, Peter, how did you get involved with the Victorian Kitchen Garden?
It's a long story, and it starts with me teaching at Bath University, becoming friendly with a chap who was doing a PhD, who left to become the first officer in the South Glamorgan Heritage Coast. And he found himself lumbered with a derelict kitchen garden, a walled garden, right in the middle of something that was intended to be a honeypot. So he had an idea that I might be able to use this site for a piece of student project work. And that's what we did for 3 years. Various things were, objects were excavated, and students were introduced to the idea of vineries and the idea of frames and all this sort of thing. Although we didn't specialise in garden history in the course, it was nice to put a little bit of garden history in because it gives context to the contemporary studies that they were meant to be doing all the rest of the time. Anyway, that happened and it was all over and I thought finished. And then a telephone call from John, the chap concerned, saying, look, HRH is visiting and I don't know a thing about this stuff that you did. And of course they've put the garden remains on his itinerary. For goodness sake, can you come over and show him round? So I duly did this, and then the local newspaper's there, facing the usual challenge of making sure that they've spelt your name wrong, and particularly if it's Thoday, and so forth. But the small piece that this guy from Bath University duly had performed went into the record, and I still don't know how, but Jennifer Davis, in her thoroughness, found, presumably by searching kitchen garden or Victorian garden or something, the fact that this had taken place. And so I'm sitting in my office at Bath University, the phone rings, this is Jennifer Davis, I'm researching the possibility of a piece of garden history, I wonder if I can ask you a few questions. Fine, answered the questions, no trouble. Phone rang a week later, it's Jennifer Davis again, I have a few more questions. Fine. Another few days, phone rang again. Look, I'm very embarrassed because I know that you're a specialist in garden history and we've no money to pay you. So I said, look, don't worry about that, Jenny, and let's get one thing straight. I am not an expert in garden history at all. I just happen to be the son of a head gardener who was one of the last of the line. I was a late child, so to speak. And I'm not answering from my desk at Bath University. I'm just searching my memory for things that I can remember as a kid. And we had vineries, and that's why I know about thinning grapes. And, we had onions, and that's why I know about bending them over. And so she said, well, that's great. I wonder if we could visit you and so on. And then I went with her to look at various quite impossible locations. And then suddenly one day she'd been talking to the producer and they said, would you like to try in front of the camera rather than do this stuff behind? Well, that's it. That's the story. I had a test and talked my way into it or out of it, whichever. And there we are.
Now, Jennifer's told me that the search for the garden went on and on and on.
Yes.
And they were literally about to shelve the whole idea when all of a sudden there was a phone call about, we found not only the garden, but we found a gardener to go with it. When was your first encounter with Harry? Was it the first day filming or did you see him beforehand?
I don't know. I think we'd made one visit to Harry in his garden prior to filming. The way the thing evolved in terms of my relationship with the whole programme was that Jenny produced a mass of ideas for every possible angle on diversity of crops, diversity of methods, eccentric methods, all of these things. Keith Sheath had sorted this lot out, but discussed with me the horticultural validity of these things. Obviously not the filmmaking validity, I had nothing to do with that at all, but I did in a way vet the proposals. And when it came to voiceovers and things, Keith and I worked together on the best wording, and at times fed stuff into Harry's thinking, and on a few occasions edited it out again when it was a bit wobbly. So that's me in the story, one of the team.
And originally there was only going to be the one episode.
Yes.
What made them decide? Because it's a bit of a leap to go from one episode to 12. In fact, I think there was 13. There were 13 episodes.
Yes, there were. And that, of course, then had the flower garden added to it as well. So
yes, did they film the flower garden? Because I seem to have a feeling that they've started filming the flower garden while they were still filming the kitchen garden.
I don't think so.
Right. Okay.
I think they may have cut into bits that were never used in the kitchen garden, because we'd made the point in the kitchen garden that the word kitchen, included orchids. So such was the range of requirements put on the shoulders of the head gardener. And that had come through, I think. So there may well have been a few bits of film around of that. But no, it was on the strength of the audience for the first series that the second series got the go-ahead. As you would expect, that worked in the usual way.
Were you surprised by the reaction of the first series?
Well, extraordinary, really.
Because
I'm equally surprised that we're sitting here
30 years later.
30 years later, and they're still, to me, very young people, having an interest in this. You see, I know nothing about the world of the media, and particularly of television and its series. It seems to me that there is equal validity in many excellently filmed and entertaining and informative programs that I enjoy. Now, I know nowadays you can simply go and buy the box. You've got the series there, and indeed, I watch a lot of canned history and archaeology and so forth. So I'm not surprised, in a sense, that the thing had that. But given that it had to be a following on the night, that did surprise me. I mean, each time an episode went out, of course, we got the figures for the viewing number, and they were remarkably high. I mean, they were probably 3 times what Keith Sheath had expected. I mustn't put words into his mouth, but I got that impression that was so. I mean, I had no idea, I'm used to talking to 50 undergraduates, not 2 or 3 million members of the public. History is a rolling programme, and you you can't, as I said, I watch quite a bit of archaeology, and the serious archaeology, to realise when they've excavated that, they come and shovel it all back over the top, for very good scientific reasons of conservation. But it's almost the same. There is a similarity between the disappearance, the reappearance, and then the disappearance again. So, yes, I wasn't sufficiently emotionally involved for that to, break my heart, so to speak. And as I've said, I've seen it happen, and I've advised it should happen on a number of occasions, because in my consultancy over the last 20 odd years, I started believing that the whole thing was going to be about modern day problems faced by landscape architects on new sites. The sort of stuff that looks like the Battle of the Somme when they're building a range of new houses or something. And thanks to the Victorian kitchen garden, I got embroiled in quite a lot of garden history. So, I am familiar with this, and I'm also familiar with having costed it. Well, before we go any further, let me tell you that I think it's going to cost you somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000. And then an extra cup of coffee, and we all shake hands, and I never hear again, which of course is understandable. So that's true.
Going back to the Victorian kitchen garden, how did it work regarding filming? Because obviously you weren't there for every day, and I would imagine the BBC just said to Harry, "We're coming on Thursday for a few hours."
Exactly.
So would you go when they were filming, or would you have your own days when you would?
I was in the kitchen garden. I was probably there 4 days out of 5, 5 days out of 6, because I was in shop for that length of time.
Where I think the rest of the series you were just voiceover.
No.
Did you appear on screen in the flower garden?
Yes, but not in the wartime garden.
Right.
Not at all.
Right.
In the wartime garden. So that was that's.
It's interesting
that's
how people have an affinity with the wartime garden, but it's still the Victorian garden that tops it.
Oh yes, and I think that's nostalgia.
And I think it goes back to this thing that, even though some people have this attitude about the wartime, we all pulled together. In Victorian times, it does seem as if everything was quieter.
Yes, I mean, the degree to which everyone, particularly I would say Jenny and Harry, saw the Victorian era through rose-tinted spectacles, I don't know. Jenny is a romantic and a wonderful, wonderful person. But she, of course, like Harry, like me, like the rest of us, had not experienced the Victorian era at all. Harry had this incredible ability to put himself back into that time, to the extent at which I had to say sometimes to Keith, Harry's talking in the first person about a skill that really wasn't practiced much after 1880. Do you think and he says, all right, we'll cover that in voiceover or something, because and there's been a sort of family joke now when anyone puts themselves so strong into a role, you're doing a Harry.
What was it like working with Harry Dodson?
It was fine. It was absolutely fine. I have had to get on with a lot of people in my life, particularly if you're doing advisory work and so forth, and they've got the checkbook. You collaborate. Harry was much easier going than very many people, but you had to remember that Harry was on his own patch. Harry was doing the work and therefore calling the shots. And also Harry was very clearly, in his mind, of a different generation and also a different background. He used to sometimes sort of forget what my day job was and said, "Oh, these college boys, they don't know what they're talking about." You know? And I never took on any of those sort of issues with Harry. Harry was a remarkably skilled craftsman who would not have been at all remarkable in 1900. He would have been one of, I would say, somewhere between 300 and 500 head gardeners of similar sized places. That's not counting the sort of 20 or 30 giant ones, the 7-acre ones like Longleat and places. We're talking about his 2-acre garden sized places. But of course, by the time this series was filmed, Harry was not one of 400 or 500. He was one of a very small remaining group. For instance, my father had been dead 20 years, so I mean that's just another indication of the story. And that is why I think you're so right in saying that it was filmed almost at the last possible moment. If you wanted that person to say, "I had the soil on my hands," I could say, "That's what I observed as a small child." But that's not the same, as saying, "I actually did this as a junior working gardener." He couldn't say he did it as a head gardener because, of course, he wasn't in that position until well after the end of the Second World War, when the whole thing had imploded to a poor shadow of itself. In other words, the owners had kept the thing going, but they really hadn't kept it going in the sense that we revealed on the film. That was why it all had to be restored before it could be filmed.
It's very easy when you watch it to forget, because you do believe that somehow they are filming it in Victorian times.
I know.
Because Harry suited the role
so well.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
And the way that it was filmed was, and you do forget, you sort of think, "Oh, yes. I didn't know they had video cameras back in 1901.
You're absolutely right that was the magic, and that's the skill of the production team, isn't it? Harry was perfect for the role. Harry was doing it naturally. Harry wasn't really. Well, it's a bit difficult. I think I mentioned to you when we were talking on the phone that Harry would have a few tricks, and sometimes he would say to me, sort of, "I know you've seen through what I'm doing, but they haven't." So don't let on. And I said, "Of course not, Harry, we're in this together." And there will be things, that I remember the pineapples. Well, the pineapples just about worked, but a bit like Heligan, they've never really had the temperatures to produce a decent crop of pineapples. And so Harry bought some. And he bought a couple of them, and he very sensibly didn't buy top grade ones about this size. He bought ones that were possible, and he just dropped them on. The fruits come in the middle of the rosette of leaves. He dropped them on the rosette of leaves, and he said, "Oh, they'll be pleased with these, Peter." And I said, yes, Harry, but don't lift the pot up, will you? Because they'll fall off. And so, yes, he was a mixture of being absolutely a natural and genuine, and also streetwise.
I was just about to ask you, you do get the sense when you watch it that there's a bit of fun going on.
Oh, yes.
That even though it's a serious documentary, that you all had great fun doing it.
Yes, we did. We didn't. There was no tension present in filming days at all. Now, I don't know about discussions in the office over budgets and blah 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 blah, but my experience of that, of filming days, which are partly in front of the camera and partly discussing what horticulturally we could do in the future, because Harry obviously had to get things ready. You know, are we going to grow sweet peas? Well, I'd say to Harry, you know, and I know that that's a hell of a lot of man hours if we're going to do those as they should be grown as cordons for cut flowers. But what's the point of having a forest of sweet peas that are just run wild up pea sticks? That's in every back garden if you want it. We're talking about a skill that people, or a series of skills that won't know about. Who knows about side shooting sweet peas in order to get a single stem, you know? So we say, yeah, well, maybe we don't, or maybe we do, you know, something of that kind. And so that was fitted in probably around lunch in a filming day. And it meant that I didn't go back in between those filming days to discuss horticulture with Harry.
How did it work, running the garden? Was it just Harry and his assistant, or was it stop the camera and then a team of 20 come in?
No, there was no team of 20. There was Harry, who incidentally was still running his small farm gate sales small holding.
Was that actually in where they filmed it, or was that next door?
Well, there's a bit of confusion here. It was within the garden, but it was out of shot. But can I just sort out the garden geography for you, because I think there's a bit of confusion here. Like many walled gardens, it had more than one compartment. So it had a dividing wall down the middle, and it had the famous green door, that we went in and out of in one compartment. And that was a compartment that you may think of as the one that was mostly filmed. Through an arch door in a cross wall, through that door you entered an equal-sized garden, and we were in and out all the time. So there was no sort of separation at all. In that garden, quite a bit had to be kept out of shot because the fruit was inappropriate in its layout, and a large aluminium glasshouse of the 1960s, Cambridge Glasshouse Company glasshouse, was sitting there. But also in that garden was the range of lean-to fruit houses. So everything that was filmed about peaches under glass or whatever, even, well, the roses under glass were the next series, but the fruit under glass, the figs, all of these things, were in that garden, on the south-facing wall of that garden. The cultivated land, there was one border of cultivated land that was used, and then the rest of it was in the garden with the green door.
What was the state of the garden when you first saw it?
Well, the only cultivation, I would say, positive seasonal cultivation, was the stuff Harry was doing to grow produce for sale, which he didn't want to give up, understandably. So almost everything that became in shot throughout the whole series was derelict, overgrown, even including the paths, the gravel paths. So any idea of sort of neatness and tidiness and weed-freeness and so forth was equally missing to whether there were any sweet peas being grown. There was a blank on each thing, including the fruit on the walls, which of course is part of the story, as you recall. Now, the structures, the frames had rotted completely. These are the lights of the frames, the covers. The glass houses were some too dangerous to go in, others Harry was still doing very simple, tough things. He might, for example, be growing some early beans from seed in the glass house, They weren't heated, of course, and they had a lot of glass missing. So, yeah, it is, I would say derelict is the word.
So Harry's assistant that we see on the screen,
yes,
did she actually stay when filming wasn't on, or was she just...
Yes.
So she was...
She was a genuine assistant, yes.
I've managed to track her down as well.
That's great.
In the series, you showed us a packet of seeds that your father had grown that you had found at the back of a cupboard.
That's it, yes.
Do you still grow those peas?
No, I don't. But that pea cultivar is now fairly readily available through heritage seeds and so forth, which is one example of quite a lot of these old varieties which have become, I wouldn't have said they swept the board in popularity, but they do have a following now, which they didn't have. I mean, the validity of making a bit of a song and dance about that was the fact that at that time such things were unobtainable and rare. Now, they weren't fully unobtainable in the literal sense, but for an amateur gardener, the viewer, there would have been a dickens of a job to get hold of it if they'd have wanted to. So it was a good story in that sense.
And what's interesting is now everybody has globe artichokes, cardoons, celeriac, scorzonera. But when the series first,
Well, I agree with you, but I think you're being a little bit optimistic,
or at least
with everybody.
At least it was put far more into the imagination of let's try something a bit different.
Yes, I mean there is a huge broadening of interest. I think we've got to say that the agriculture, the horticultural equipment and agri-chemicals world tells us that there are 13 million amateur gardeners in Britain, which is a figure we use quite a lot to say, well, we should get an audience. There's 13 million amateur gardeners out there. But this is the sort of thing that actually is more to do with, yes, there are 13 million people with a bit of grass or something rather than gardeners. I think the RHS, on a sober day, would put the figure down at nearer to 2 million than 13 million. But there's still a lot of people enthusiastically growing things. They don't all grow vegetables, of course. But to come back to your point, I think that Heligan, the Victorian Kitchen Garden series and so forth, numbers of bright spots around the country have actually stimulated an interest in those sort of things, much more than existed before. I wonder if I can just come into this point of an attitude towards the growing of vegetables. It was always considered that other than the regular Friday night television gardening programs, you had to have masses of colour, and it had to be a great garden before you filmed it, before you introduced it through a presenter, before you used it in your programme. The dead hand with vegetables. Nobody wants to see a line of cabbages, you know, they want to see a rhododendron in full flower, or a bedding scheme or something. And actually what really came over, and comes over every day down at Heligan, is that people love looking at other people cultivating vegetables and fruit, let's say. And that really surprised a lot of people in the BBC, I think. You know, what are these people? This is not really a gardening programme, and there they are sitting. They said, the one comment that did come through was, they said, that chap Dodson was lighting a bonfire, and they filmed him. Not just when the first match went out, but, you know, when they said, it's ridiculous. Why are people interested in this sort of thing? But and that, I think that pleased us. You know, that pleased the team very much. But that again, of course, is thanks to Keith Sheether, who knew that that was an interesting item.
What was the time between the first series being filmed and the second?
I don't know. 1 year?
So had the first series gone out first, then they'd gone,
Yeah.
this
Yes,
is it,
yeah,
right,
the
okay.
first series was definitely the justification
Because people
for
tend
the
to
second.
forget that Ruth Mott doesn't appear until the third series. Until we go into the kitchen, the Victorian kitchen.
Really?
She's not in the first one. She's not in Kitchen Garden. The people that appear in the kitchen of the kitchen
She's
garden are, I don't know who they are. I think they belonged to Chiltern Estate. She wasn't in the flower one, but she
didn't realise that.
but she was in the kitchen one.
Yeah.
So she appeared in the third one, and I can't remember now.
But she was the frightening. Her role was the frightening cook who would tear strips off Harry if he didn't produce things of the right quantity and quality and timing. He introduced this idea of the kitchen being the interface between him and the owner and the boss, and the owner would complain, but not complain to him, but complain to the cook, and she would come down and sort him out because of the failure of something or whatever. And he introduced that idea that although she was another servant of the establishment, she was the intermediary, she was the voice and the critic of what was going on.
What was it like to work with her?
She was very good.
Can we start that off by just saying her name?
Yes, Ruth Mott, again, brilliantly played her part. I think everyone agrees, as the cook. Again, put herself back into period times, which she hadn't really, of course, experienced. She's a younger woman than Harry was, so there we are. But she was, I think, easier to work with from the rest of us' point of view. Very, very good to work with. I think she was a little bit competitive with Harry, the two stars. In the thing, but nothing that showed on the surface at all. But she was, she was very good, yes. And she was more, well, two things about Ruth. First of all, she was much more critical of the system of servant and master, of hierarchy, squirearchy, much more system. You couldn't imagine that Ruth would do anything other than vote Labour. Harry, you'd never guess his politics, but to all intents and purposes, he was on the side of the old social structures, and you know, that was it. So Harry was in contrast in that way. It was Ruth who would say, "Oh, they didn't know what they were eating half the time. We could always drop in something and call it something else. Put some sauce on it," she'd say, or something of these kinds. Harry, no.
Ruth told me once that they weren't allowed to eat the food that they'd made because the dishes and the cutlery that they were using to make the food wasn't really up to hygienic standards. So she said a lot of the food literally was filmed and went in the bin.
Oh, yes, I expect so, yes.
But she did used to bring a cake to set
yes.
every time she was filming.
Yes.
Now,
that's an interesting contrast. She would bring a cake to the set. I don't know, and of course she was then retired, yes. So the ingredients, she'd bought those, so that's her, that was her money and her time had gone into that cake. And Harry would sell you some cabbages. And fair enough, because, that's what he was earning his income from. In his small market garden,
What a difficult question. Do you have a favourite series?
No, I don't. I would say, however, that I think the flower garden gets overlooked, and there's a lot of good horticultural history, which is, the thing that motivated me to do this was that we could record history before it was too late, rather than to entertain several million people. But
is there anything you would change about the series if you could go back?
I don't think so. I mean, you're asking me to go back, and I really haven't thought that much about the series. Tens of years. So no, I don't think so. If you said to me, how would you structure a series, I'd make something incredibly boring and academic that no one would watch anyway. So I wouldn't be a very good person to do that, because we always tried to be truthful. I say we being particularly Keith and myself in the cutting room and in the voiceover, or going through the script, if you like. We certainly tried to be accurate in that sense. So it was really by omission that things were missed out. But they had to be in order to have the programme running at the right speed.
What's your fondest memory of the entire experience?
Probably recalling the going into the fruit on the glasshouse walls and seeing something that I'd never expected to see again, which was peaches being faced up in order to colour evenly round. Now, it's only a very small piece of one episode, but it's sort of quintessential hands-on husbandry of a crop that has disappeared for obvious reasons, that now, your peaches come in trays from various parts of the world. But to me, that intensity of effort to produce a perfect specimen sort of typified the whole business of this Victorian endeavour. people ask me a lot of times about Victorian gardening and where I rated Victorian gardening. And I would say that it had an excellence of technique, it had an excellence of productivity, highly productive, small areas of land and so forth. But of course it lost itself in the challenge of perfection. And that's a very, it's a very enticing idea that you can go way beyond flavour, well beyond yield, well beyond, well, let's stick with those two, those essential elements, to appearance. And this is exactly what happens in the local flower show. The fanatic in the local flower show is extremely worried about any spots on the foliage of a leek. Now, the foliage of the leek is going to get chopped off before it leaves the patch, before it arrives in the kitchen. The whole leek is then going to be chopped up and cooked before it reaches the table. And yet somehow we've got this horticultural pride in the foliage of the leek being perfect. And there's that, in a sense, is the Victorian aspiration of those gardeners. And it's still with us for the amateur flower show, but it really has, it's unconnected with flavour, it's unconnected with tenderness of the product. It is a thing unto itself. And that's something which professionally and intellectually I can condemn, as nonsense. Well, laugh at as nonsense. But I have to say that there's part of me that really thinks, wow, fancy them being able to carry this cultivation of this plant up to this level. And then we're talking about a leek. We're not talking about an orchid in a pot that's going onto a dining room table where spotted and half moth-eaten leaves would rather detract. We're actually talking about something that in reality never even leaves the patch of land. And that's interesting, and that is the sort of Victorian stuff which I hope the series didn't over-egg that aspect. But it's one of the driving forces that gives Harry his pride in being a professional. I don't know if you recall, we did the Lily of the Valley forcing in the conical shape. Now, that, you see, that in a sense, that's as dead as a dodo. That really is a piece of history. Almost, you would say it's a piece of prehistory. But not really, because of course everything that we did is endlessly described in the hundreds of books in the English language written between 1800 and 1920 about gardening. I mean, it is the most rich library, and again a library that now has been amassed at Helligan thanks to Philip Macmillan Browse. They have a wonderful coverage of Victorian books. But I say that that is completely a piece of history, Harry's creation of that thing. But internationally, there is a trade in frozen, what are called pips of Lily of the Valley for wedding flowers, produced in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in Germany, in specialist nurseries. And you can buy them frozen in blocks with water around them and sphagnum moss. And you can force those into flower in your house if you want to, but in the dark, and it takes about 26 days to produce the flowers. So curiously, there is an industry, because enough brides want enough lily of the valley in that way. I think more so probably on the mainland of Europe than in Britain, because it was a much more symbolic flower there. But what Harry was doing was producing it as a feature in house decoration as opposed to a wedding bouquet. And that, I think, is absolutely historic. But it's not true to say that no one knows anything about Lily of the Valley anymore. They certainly do. And, you know, Mr. Google will tell you where you can buy it. So it's isn't it, a completely lost story.
How did this series affect you? Like, Ruth Mott went on and to be the technical consultant for motion pictures for Gosford Park.
Did she? I didn't know that.
What was the fame aspect like?
It wasn't. It wasn't there. It was, the fame was rightly Harry's. And at that point, I felt much more in company with Jenny Davis as the people that had made the truth be revealed and not over-egged it and not allowed it to get warped, but still produced for our masters, the BBC, a very saleable programme. But there was no, I mean, it didn't, yeah, I did, I gave talks to the appropriate garden societies. I say appropriate because I don't do amateur garden talks. That's not my thing. But, you know, the local village says please, and of course you say, yeah, fine, you know. But
you have been stopped in the street.
Oh, yeah, well, that happens every, I don't know, to start with, I suppose, every few weeks or so, somebody would say, yeah, would you mind signing this bit of paper or something? Yes, but that very quickly goes away. I mean, people don't remember. People remember Harry, and that's as it should be. You know, you don't want. You're not there to compete with the chap who's perceived to be the skilled gardener. I mean, if anything irritated a bit, pricked the ego a bit, it was the fact that I think, quite honestly, due to my childhood, I could have done Harry's job with my hands. I couldn't have done Harry's job in any other sense of his communicating and his history. But I could actually do those jobs, but I wasn't being asked to do those jobs, and it would have confused people, because Harry had to appear to be the last in the line that could do those things. So I forget, did we do any budding or grafting of any kind?
There was grafting, but
Yes.
it was done by somebody
yes,
else.
That's right.
By
it was
Brogdale.
George. Oh, by
Yeah.
Brogdale,
Yeah.
because it was that story of the cultivar of apple. Yeah, I remember. But it would have been quite confusing and wrong, bad filmmaking to have two of us doing these so-called skilled things. I would say dexterous things.
Were there any funny incidents that you remember?
Well, you said, was it a cheerful bunch? Yes, it was. And particularly, you know, the film crews always have a laugh, as you'll know. I mean, it's one of those things where somebody's going to get their trousers wet and everybody else is going to laugh. But I don't remember a series of mistakes turning into hilarity. You know, you get this. Well, it's become one form of humour on television, isn't it? What went wrong next? You know, there wasn't anything. I don't recall anything like that, and that isn't in Keith Sheether's nature. Keith is a very serious filmmaker, and there wasn't a great deal of room for, you know, larking around.
Do you feel the series achieved its objective?
From my point of view, definitely. I hope from the point of view of the BBC being obsessed with viewing numbers, I hope that box got ticked as well. Certainly my box got ticked, and that is very much our box, meaning Jenny and myself, because I was trying to make it right for myself, but I was also trying to make it right for Jenny, because Jenny held the spirit of the thing, and you know, needed obviously all the support you could give her.
I don't think the series would be made now. It was done at the right time,
yeah,
and everything fell into place.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be produced at the moment. Have you been back to the garden since filming?
No, I haven't. I've heard of its disappearance as a garden, but I haven't myself been back.
There could be a second series of putting it back to how Harry had it. Maybe we'll phone you in another 30 years.
Well, I think that indeed would be an extraordinary thing if that happened. But it's this is an opportunity, in a sense, to get to the core of the matter. You know, what it really was about, and in comparison with other programs. I mean, we have discussed both on the phone and today that this had an unusual following. And perhaps the most unusual thing about its following is how persistent that following has been. And it's even become a following, as I understand it, of people who didn't watch the thing when it was coming on air as a broadcast, but have actually become followers through buying the canned product as opposed to watching it on air. That, I think, is unusual. At least I'm told it's unusual. This is not my field, but I understand it's unusual. Now, let's make some comparisons between those series and other documentaries whose brief must also be to entertain and to be accurate. Well, the superb examples, the supreme examples, are of course the stuff coming from the Natural History Unit in Bristol, David Attenborough et al. But if we move away from that area of excellence, and it's thousands and thousands of hours of patient filming upon which it's built, you come to a whole raft of programs where the presenter either has to demonstrate how incompetent they are, or by failing to do certain craft challenges, almost sort of thread a needle, cut some grass with a scythe, make a fool of yourself. that will mitigate the fact that we've been quite serious in telling people that in 1900 there were 1,000 people doing this. Now we've got to make them laugh. So we've actually got to get someone who can't do a job to try and do it. This irritates me intensely. This sort of approach to social history. You know, there were all these people having this really tough life in a coal mine or a cotton mill or something. So I'll give you a pick and you try and hack out some coal, which totally misses the point that these people, through their lifestyle, were very skilled at doing these things. Because Harry was able to be skilled and to conserve his energy because he knew how to do the job. He didn't have to drop his spade after 2 minutes and say, "Oh, this is killing me. I had no idea it was like this." No, he could do it for 8 hours because he could really do it. And surely it is better to film somebody who can actually do the thing than it is to get somebody to demonstrate very easily that if you can't do it, it's both unproductive but also very, very, very tiring in that way. So we didn't badly prune something. And to say, "Oh, I got blisters all over my hands because I couldn't hold the tool properly." Those are the things that irritate me about this so-called investigation into social history. Very hard to achieve this, because you can't actually put a group of children into a poor law institute in order to show what life was like for a 10-year-old in 1900. You can do it with a bed of carrots. This last point about reality is to me a very important one, that we did give the subject an honest airing, and we gave it through the eyes of a man who was the best bet we had or could possibly have had as a Victorian head gardener. I mean, Harry was believable as somebody who was one generation, at least one generation, out of time. And isn't that incredibly lucky that Harry was found in that way? Because you are asking somebody to really to take on a role that they could barely remember, and then take it on in a senior position as the person who made the decisions, the head gardener. And that's even, that's even more difficult, I think. So it boils down to the fact that the moment was seized, the right man was found, the garden was propped up enough to make it look real, and there was very, very, very little cheating.
Did you stay in contact with anybody after the series had finished?
Jenny, obviously. Keith, we've exchanged Christmas cards and spoken and met up at usually the sad moments like funerals and so forth. But I haven't kept up with anyone else because my life moved on, or moved back to contemporary issues, if you like, in a way, and writing and so on. I went back to the day job. I started to take my profession, its history over 10,000 years, as a theme, as a personal interest rather than as a commission for cash. Don't think there's any cash in it at all. And as a result of that, I wrote a couple of books. One on the story of cultivation, which is essentially how we developed the sort of things that we saw in the film of Victorian gardens, flower and vegetable, and then the history of the plants that have been developed from the wild through selection, through plant breeding, and ultimately, as we know today, the very different plants that we have compared with the wild. Those two books resulted from that, and I'm just finishing a third book at the moment, which is for landscape architects, trying to explain some of the techniques which are best used for establishing plants on difficult sites, which sounds terribly technical, and indeed it is compared with garden history, because it's certainly not historic. It is essentially problems of today. And the bigger machines they use, the bigger the problem they leave behind. So my first thought was amazement that there was still interest. It is a very long while, and it is surprising to me that the enthusiasm is there among people not just of my generation but of younger generations who appreciate what we tried to do and are still curious and fascinated by it. And so yes, it's wow. There's still an interest. I guess that's the summary of my feelings. I was amazed.